Unpopular truth. We repeat what we don't repair. What that really means, in my opinion, is life is going to keep handing you the lessons until you learn it. My name is Heather, and I am a relationship and empowerment coach. And one of my favorite things to do is work with people in distinguishing their blind spots, their barriers and obstacles they put in their own way that prevent them from having the relationships they truly desire in life. Last week in this video series about emotional unavailability, we talked about how emotional unavailability will disguise itself. We talked about how it will show up, some of the signs and symptoms of it. This week, we're going to talk about what you can do about it. Let's start by talking about the cost of emotional unavailability. This really painful pattern will keep you feeling alone in your life, separate from, not fully connected to other people. If you've ever wondered how you can be in a crowded room and feel alone, or despite the number of friends you have, the large social network, the office people that you work with, that you still have the experience of being on your own, this is that pattern. And the only way that you can start to have a different experience in your life, feeling connected with people, feeling deeply connected in your relationships, having them feel satisfying, is to actually do the work to change this pattern, which means, in short, learning how to let people in. So today we're going to talk about some simple, not easy, but simple ways that you can work towards making it safer and more comfortable for yourself to let people in. As I said at the top of this conversation, it's really important that you start looking at yourself for this whole process, that you really start looking at how you can change the way you operate in your life so that you can start experiencing the things that you want. The first step that we're going to talk about is, what are your coping mechanisms? This can sometimes be easier to identify by looking at experiences that you've had in the past and start to look at how you'd like them to be different in the future. If we start looking at an example of one of the symptoms, so in the last video we talked about symptoms of emotional unavailability, what it'll start to look like or the ways that it'll show up. One of the examples was avoiding committing to plans. Short-term, long-term didn't really seem to matter. There was always this sense of avoiding actually saying and fully saying yes to something. So if you look at that pattern of behavior and ask yourself, where have I experienced this in relationships before? And what did it feel like for me, or what was the impact for me? If I think about the times that I've experienced this in my relationships in the past, it's always left me feeling like unimportant, that maybe they were looking for something better than me to spend time with. It started to create a sense of insecurity, and it would flare up attachment style wounding. It was just not great all around. And the way I would handle it would either be to go to the end of the spectrum of pursuing, trying to get them to say yes to something, or to the other end of the spectrum, which is more about proving that they're worth it, or that they really want to be with me. And so either way, it would have me start acting weird in the relationship. I wouldn't be showing up as my authentic self. I'd be showing up as this contrived version of me, trying to get them to show me that they liked me. And that isn't a healthy experience to have in a relationship. All it'll do is create mistrust, resentment, contempt, and distance. So learning to be able to change this part for yourself is going to be critical. Let's look at another example of emotionally unavailable behavior and how it impacts you in relationships, how you react, and then how that feels for you. So if we look at the example of struggling to receive, someone who has a really hard time allowing people to contribute to them. That might be contributing time, it might be contributing monetarily. It can be as light and easy as compliments. I'm sure you know people who tend to deflect the compliment away with a diminishment of some kind, like, oh, I just got it on sale, or oh, thanks, but and point out something that's a flaw, or whatever the thing is, or oh, I could have done better. Like, I'm sure you've witnessed those things before. Those are all examples of not being able to receive. Of course, not being able to receive love is a little bit of a bigger experience, but it's still kind of all in the same spectrum. When you look at how you react or respond when you have someone who will not let you contribute to them. So you might want to help them with something. You might want to be a shoulder for them to cry on. You might really just want to let them know that you love them, and they just keep keeping you at arm's length. That can be for crazy making. It can make you start to question whether or not there's something wrong with you. It can make you start to wonder whether or not there's something that you should be doing differently. Again, it feeds all of those insecurities. And when you have people who will not allow you to contribute to them in a relationship, all it will do is erode trust. It will erode connection, any connection that is available. And it keeps relationships almost surface. I assume part of the reason that you're looking into this series is because you're looking for deep, meaningfully connected relationships. And part of what's necessary in that is being able to receive, not just contribute. The final example we're going to look at for emotionally unavailable behaviors and the corresponding reactions that you have is going to be people who avoid responsibility through projection and blame, finger pointing, all of that stuff. In a relationship, a deeply connected relationship where you feel emotionally safe, where you feel like there is a real level of trust available, it requires that people are responsible for the impact they have on the relationship, intended or not. There is a real thing of unintended impact, that I said something the way I said it, and I did not mean for you to hear it the way that you heard it. And although you get to be responsible for the way that you heard it, I also get to be responsible for the way that I said it. And we get to have a conversation about that and look at how can we do that differently moving forward. Taking responsibility for things can also include like making plans or failing to do something that you said you were going to do. Any of those pieces of it are all part of taking responsibility. And when you have an experience in relationships where someone is just consistently like rejecting responsibility and accountability and blaming all of the other, like all the other people, all the other circumstances, whatever it is in their world as to why things went the way that they went, all it does is breed resentment and contempt in the relationship, as well as kill off trust. You can't trust people who aren't responsible. It doesn't, you just can't. I mean, you can try, but it's only a recipe for heartache. So step 2 for breaking this painful pattern is going to be setting new boundaries. Setting boundaries can be hard for people for a couple of reasons. One of them being that they aren't really sure what new boundaries they want. Part of the reason that we were looking at the reactions in step 1 is so that we can start looking at what would make you feel better. So if we're going to go back through those examples and look at what would have made you feel better in those situations instead of the behavior that you experienced. So if we go back to example 1, the inability to commit to plans, maybe the new boundary that you want to set is something like a willingness to commit to plans with flexibility. Part of the reason that people sometimes will avoid creating a commitment to a plan that's a little out there in the future has nothing to do with emotional unavailability. It can really be around, I just need some flexibility and I like spontaneity. And spontaneity and flexibility is a really critical part of any relationship. However, you want to make sure that there is also space for commitment around, I know we're going to do something in the future, whether that's, going to a concert or a play in a week or two, or planning a vacation a few months from now. You want to have the security and confidence that that's possible. And of course, if something comes up and there needs to be a change to the behavior or a change to the plan, that's okay, that there's room for that to happen. When you have a relationship where you're openly communicating about these things, and I know that you're going to follow through with the plans that you created most of the time, and then as we get to it, be responsible for the impact if we have to change plans, there's lots of room for flexibility. There's lots of room for spontaneity. So setting a boundary for yourself around, it's really important to me when I'm in relationships with people that they're capable of committing to plans and following through, and that there's flexibility for changing them, might be a really great way to go. The next behavior that we're going to talk about is trouble receiving. And maybe the new boundary that you want to create is conscious practice of allowing and receiving. As I mentioned, there's lots of ways that people will deflect and avoid receiving. The one that's most critical in the world of relationships has to do with love and an ability to receive love. More often than not, the tendency to deflect, reject, or avoid receiving comes from a tendency to protect ourselves from getting hurt. And often the root of that will stem from I don't believe I'm lovable, so I can't really receive your love because I have some stuff going on about my own lovability. When that's happening in a relationship, it doesn't matter how much you try to love a person. It doesn't matter how much you try to tell them that they matter to you, that they're worth it, that you see them as being wonderful people. If they can't see that themselves, if they don't believe that for themselves, they will never believe it coming from you. You can't do it enough to make them believe it. So that's really an important thing to consider when you're looking at building relationships with people is, can they receive the love that you're trying to give? It may be something that they're totally open to learning how to do. They may have spent a whole bunch of life, you may have spent a whole bunch of your life deflecting and rejecting the contribution of love. I know I certainly have. When there's a willingness to learn, you can certainly put that new boundary in place of a conscious practice of allowing and receiving. And that means that when you are trying to contribute to the other person with your love, with your affection, with whatever it is that you're trying to do, that they will, before they just automatically reject it, that they'll stop and think about it and work at allowing it to sink in. Easier said than done, of course. And this might be a really important new boundary for you when you're thinking about building relationships with people. The final new boundary we're going to talk about here will be in relation to someone who is consistently deflecting, avoiding and blaming other people, so avoiding taking responsibility. And the new boundary that you can set for yourself in regards to the people you choose to get involved with, or new boundaries inside of relationships with people, is taking responsibility. As I mentioned previously, responsibility is a critical part of creating emotional safety inside of a relationship. If all we're going to be doing is projecting, blaming, and pointing fingers, we're never actually going to be able to create the kind of connection that you're looking for. One of the best ways I've heard this talked about is the concept of you are 100% responsible for your 50% of a relationship. That means this space is mine, and then that space is yours. And anything that happens inside of this space, I'm responsible for. I'm responsible for cleaning up any mess that happens in there, any breakdown that happens in there, any needs that are there. I'm responsible for all of those things, 100%. This isn't about scorekeeping in a relationship. This isn't about the division of chores or division of labor or anything like that. This isn't about that argument that can happen sometimes around, I do 50% of these things and you do 50% of these things. This is strictly in relationship to responsibility. And so when you look at it from that perspective of I'm 100% responsible for my 50% of this relationship, my part of what happens in this relationship, it gives you a really clear area of what is yours to be working on, what is yours to be looking at, as well as what belongs over there with them. When people have a tendency towards deflecting and blaming, one of the things that can start to happen is a questioning of, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that is my responsibility. Maybe I shouldn't be asking for that, or maybe that isn't fair. When you have this perspective of 100% responsibility, it makes all of those conversations a lot clearer. It reduces the opportunity for gaslighting, which is also a big part of what happens inside of avoiding responsibility. This one would be a worthwhile one to be looking at and practicing for yourself. My recommendation at this point for sure would be to go back and look at the second video where you can check out what all the different examples of symptoms or disguises that emotional unavailability wears, how emotional unavailability shows up, and then look for yourself at how you've experienced different versions of that in your relationships and how that's impacted you. And then when you look at it from that perspective, what would you rather experience instead? So you can really identify for yourself what some clear new boundaries are about what works for you in a relationship and what doesn't. Setting boundaries is a radical act. It can really feel like you're being mean. It can feel like you're being too demanding. It can feel like you're writing people off. It can, especially if you're not used to setting boundaries, it can be really uncomfortable. And it's a critical part to having relationships that have healthy emotional connection in them, healthy emotional safety in them, healthy trust, healthy respect. It's a critical part of that. Dr. Brené Brown talks about boundaries being the way that you teach people to love you. And it's when you set boundaries with me, it teaches me how I can love you, what you need, where your limits are. They're really important. So although they're uncomfortable and you may not have learned how to do that a lot in your life, or you may not have a lot of practice doing that, it's a very worthwhile skill to learn. The final step in this 3-step process for dealing with emotional unavailability in your relationships is that it's all up to you. When it comes down to it, you are the one who is engaging in the pattern. You are the one who is allowing the behavior is okay in your relationships. Even if it feels like it's the other people that are doing the thing, you're still making it okay by allowing it or tolerating it in your relationships. So at the end of the day, this comes down to you doing the work for yourself so that you can stop repeating the patterns and actually move forward into the type of relationship that you really want. A couple of closing thoughts for you around emotional unavailability in general. One of them is that there will always be some relationships in your life that have a level of emotional unavailability in them. That doesn't mean that you have to get rid of them. You just get to look at them and accept them for what they are. So that might be a family member. It might be a friend that you want to stay connected with. It might be a business associate that you want to stay connected with. All that matters inside of those things is that you set your expectations appropriately based on what is actually available in that situation. When you have the situation of someone who is not really emotionally available and you keep trying to make them that way or get them to become that way or interacting with them as if they are, you will always create some discord and friction in the relationship. So letting that go and accepting relationships as they are for what they are will really help to alleviate a lot of stress for you in this situation. Another thing is that you may find, especially if you're currently in a romantic relationship where there's a level of emotional unavailability, that there's complementary emotional unavailability styles at play. And that's fine, and it doesn't mean that the relationship is doomed or needs to end. What is really important is that there's conversation happening and that there's room for growth and change together. If both parties are doing the work and looking towards making some changes together and supporting each other inside of doing that, that makes everything way easier. So just bear that in mind, that just because you may have some tendencies inside of the relationship you're in currently doesn't mean that the relationship has to end. It might just be necessary to have some conversations about how can we make some changes here, because these things are actually hurting us as a couple. And finally, in closing, I think I would mention that it's really challenging to do this kind of work on your own. This type of stuff often lives in the blind spot, in the background, in the subconscious, which is really challenging for people to be able to see on their own. It's often way more effective to have some kind of outside intervention who can help you see the patterns you're missing. You're so ingrained in it, so doing the same thing over and over the way that you've always done it, that it can be really challenging to see where the opportunities to do things differently are, where you can shift your perspective, somewhere a new boundary might need to be drawn. So working with somebody who can help you see those things makes a huge difference. So Find a support group, find a coach, find a therapist, find somebody, an expert that can help you deal with this so that you can break this pattern once and for all. You deserve to have a relationship where you feel emotionally seen, supported, cared for, important, special, and safe in. You deserve that, regardless of what any of the stories in your mind might tell you or what your past experience may tell you. You deserve that. So give yourself the gift of breaking the pattern by finding somebody who can help you do that. And then you'll be well on your way to having the relationships that you want. That's it for now regarding emotional unavailability. I really hope that you found some value in this series. If you haven't already, I highly recommend that you go back and watch the first video and the second video in this series. And don't forget, there's companion worksheets that go along with each of these videos to help you work through some of these things and help you make a start towards changing some of these patterns. There's also a blog series that goes through each of these things as well. So if you like to have things written out for you or be able to read it and that integrates differently, there is a blog series link down below as well. Thank you so much for being here and tuning in. I really enjoy spending this time with you, and I look forward to the next time we meet. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment below. It'll actually be me that's the one who's responding to those comments, and I love to hear from my watchers. So until next time, take care.